in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Loa Boots. Start your day off on the right foot with footwear that was designed for those who stand relentlessly in the face of adversity. I wear Loa every single day, for miles on canine searches and for hours on tactical operations in inclement weather. No matter what, Loa keeps me moving. Whether you run, hike, hunt, or fight, on the streets or out in the woods, Loa has the gear you need to help you conquer whatever challenges you face. Go check out their new line of trail running shoes at Loa Boots, L-O-W-A Boots.com, and get outside for some fresh air and daylight. Loa, for those who know where they're going and won't stop until they get there.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com. So, Mike, we have now done, by my count, 173 episodes. We have lasted longer than almost every podcast except for like that Jocko guy and that Rogan guy, as far as I can tell. But who's ever heard of their podcast? Whatever. We're where it's at. And it occurred to me on Tactical Tangents, we should probably talk about when and how you're actually allowed to do tactical things to the bad guys. I understand there are some rules for cops, and while those rules are not the same for private citizens or the military most of the time, I think there are some things those two groups could stand to learn from Copverse. So I think we should talk about them tonight.
Yeah, I think just the way of thinking about some of the things and some of the case law, some of the things the courts have said about use of force for law enforcement are things that, although law enforcement specific, are still interesting thought processes. So it's definitely a good discussion.
I'll bet we have at least one listener, at least one out there, who's like got a little bit of that sovereign citizen, has watched those YouTube videos like, I don't have to get out of the car, I'm a sovereign citizen. And like, there might be some education here for you, where you might hear from Officer Mike that actually you might have a responsibility to get out of the car when you're directed to, and that Mike has some authorities here to do some cop things to you if you don't get out of the car. So that's kind of what we're trying to figure out tonight.
Yeah, so there's obviously the standard disclaimers we have to talk about, which is my experience is limited to the area and the town that I work in. There's a lot of local policy. There's also state laws, and those state laws vary, obviously, state to state. There's a lot of factors that affect all of this stuff. So we're not here to give you legal advice. I cannot tell you that because I said it's okay, a court or your boss is going to say it's okay.
No, definitely bring it up in court. Be like, no, Mike and Jim said I was good to shoot that guy. Yeah.
So this is not a formal class. Like, I teach this stuff at my agency, not in this exact format, obviously, but there's a whole lot of practical application that goes into this, and that can be lost in kind of a discussion like this one.
Yeah. That said, there is a lot that we can say about it, and I think we need to. Like, we can elevate the discussion, honestly, even among the cop listeners, especially maybe among the cop listeners. And I think all of our listeners are smart enough to know that a podcast isn't a formal class. We're trying to reinforce and refresh what you may have learned at formal training and help you take more from your formal classes. Like when you go take a concealed carry class, or when you go to the police academy, or you do your refresher training. How often do you have to do refresher training in your agency on use of force? Is it annual, biannual, every 3 weeks?
It depends when stuff comes out, when changes occur. It's not really, it's kind of ongoing, right? And we'll talk about some of this. It's because it's grounded in the things that are already well established. At the end of the day, like, they haven't changed. It's that day-to-day application that really matters, right? And so, yeah, there are use of force scenarios that I would say in-service training at least once or twice a year, probably there's some version of that. But man, a shoot, no shoot scenario is one thing. There's a whole lot of gray squishy stuff in the middle.
And I think it might be worth addressing up front that like policing and police use of force has kind of changed over time, right? Like I remember growing up, it wasn't terribly unusual to hear about Edison medicine to help motivate people out of the car with a taser. Or I remember those big Maglite flashlights with like 8 D-cell batteries to help motivate people who didn't want to be motivated.
Radios used to be a lot bigger too.
Yeah, radios, nightsticks used to be a big thing, right? The Rodney King beating happened. And a funny thing, I think that body-worn cameras have probably made a difference, probably for the better, honestly, for everybody. Oh, yeah. I think it made the world better for cops. And man, there's some real resistance to that. Even now, their agencies are very resistant to it, like the feds. But it has brought mostly very positive change, even if we beat the snot out of people less these days, hopefully.
Yeah, I've made this case before. Like when we first got cameras, there's no way to make a dog bite look pretty. We've talked about that before. And if I send a dog on somebody and I make a grown man cry, right? Like it doesn't look good on video typically to a jury when you just look at that part. And then there's the blood and the gory part sometimes. But ever since getting a camera, I can tell you my use of force reports have gotten a lot simpler because I roll the tape, dude. And usually you see like I gave the guy a bunch of warnings, way more than I had to. And it was very clear the police were there. It was very clear a dog was there. It was very clear what was going to happen if he didn't listen, and he still didn't listen. And so it's like, all right, like the video makes the case for me. And so it does nothing but help me, really.
Yeah, like people knock on the TV show Cops, but I maintain the TV show Cops did more to advance the standing of law enforcement and the credibility of law enforcement in the country than like 85 billion police public relations officers have.
Yeah.
Right, because you can see the world through their eyes.
Yeah. So the point of this discussion is to encourage some critical thinking and some discussion between you and your colleagues, especially if you're in law enforcement, and to figure out amongst yourselves what to do with some of that as professionals. So that being said, we're talking about police use of force. It's not concealed carry or self-defense, obviously, but fundamentally using force boils down to being reasonable. So whether that's to effect an arrest or in self-defense, that is kind of king. The problem is reasonable minds differ all the time. And in my circle, even with the people that I work very, very closely with, we still, on any given day, have very vigorous debates about how much force is appropriate or tactics or officer safety or whatever, about whether or not those were the right decisions to make in any given situation. And we very often disagree. Does that make any one of us unreasonable? If you get one guy who makes a use of force decision and 2 other people in the room, and I think it was okay and Jim thinks it wasn't, who wins that vote? Well, that depends on the judge and the jury, potentially, or your bosses. So therein lies the rub, right? This is complicated, and I think it's why a discussion about it at a local and practical level, i.e. take this back to work and back to the table and talk about some of this stuff and figure out maybe what changes or modifications or scenarios or training you can put together or something. Don't just assume that this discussion settles it.
Yeah. So in 2024, 2025, I think we have gotten very binary in our thinking: good, bad, good, evil, murder, righteous, kind of that Twitter style thinking. If it's not 25 characters, I don't want to hear about it. The problem is this is the complicated stuff, and you got to understand why it's complicated in order to make it simple when it's time to make it simple, right? So we're going to get into some nuance. Mike brought up a couple of very important points there. First, let's talk about civilian personal defense, because parts of this apply and parts of it don't. As a civilian out in the ecosystem of the world, you generally don't have a duty or a right to chase down and confront a bad guy. One of the big reasons we have a government in the first place is so that we can outsource and monopolize our application of force to properly constituted authorities. That's like the whole point of a government. Otherwise, we could just do the Somalia, anarchy utopia thing, right?
Warlords and
yeah, which I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. There are parts of it that are fun, but mostly not, right? So, as a civilian, don't get in a fight when you don't have to. Don't get in a fight when you should be calling the cops or walking away. Don't chase down bad guys. Let the cops chase down the bad guys. It's what you're paying them for. It's what you have outsourced. It's the government services that your tax dollars go toward, right? Second, Mike brought up the word reasonable. And reasonable is like a really, really big concept in almost all legal stuff. I'm not a lawyer, but I've taken a lot of law classes, and I can tell you it is like the first and last thing you talk about in legal stuff. And the biggest thing you need to get from that is that reasonable minds can differ. Reasonable people can disagree. However, there are some boundaries that we as a society have for what you can or should do. Some of those are written down, but a lot of them aren't. If you're dealing with a hostile person out and about, it is reasonable to call the cops. It is reasonable to try to walk away. It is reasonable to tell them to back off. It might be reasonable to shout at them to back off. It might be reasonable to shoot them in the face. But it depends. Your actions have to be somewhere within the window, within the boundary of what the cops, the lawyers, and the jurors will think is reasonable. There's a window. It's not one action. It's a section of the spectrum of actions you can't do. And that's what we're trying to understand right now is where is that window?
And the big thing about that window that you have to understand is there is still a case to be made, right? You could point to something written down, a boundary that is in some state law, but whether that fits or not is going to literally be judged probably by several people, by the cops on scene when they investigate it, by the witnesses who saw and interpreted their version of the events, by the prosecutors who decide whether or not to charge you, the civil litigators who decide whether or not to sue you, and the judges and the juries that ultimately figure out the outcomes of those cases. So I want this to be practical for you. I don't want to bog us down with a bunch of academics, obviously. So I'm going to try to avoid some of the rabbit holes. We'll just skim the surfaces. But it is a topic that requires a little bit of intellect and critical thinking. So we have to address some of those things. We're going to go through a couple of those court cases. And I'm not going to read the whole thing and tell you the whole, I just want you to understand some of the verbiage that was used in terms of interpreting the actions of someone in a situation like this. That's the point of using it, okay? For the non-law enforcement listeners, I think Jim really already addressed this, but just understanding this outside of your own, something you might face, a self-defense scenario or crime prevention scenario, outside of that, like he mentioned the show Cops. I think just understanding this is a good way of thinking about use of force, and obviously understanding it for the sake of the hot topic that might come to the community or town near you, or even the Thanksgiving dinner discussion, or something among friends and family that are getting fired up because they're very emotional about something that they feel, and maybe there's another perspective that can be offered. And I think if you see one of these interactions that goes sideways, this might be a way that you can shed some light on it, not only for yourself, but for the people around you.
Yeah, it'll make you a better citizen, better voter, better juror, and those are good things, right? And for one, you might find yourself on the receiving end of a law enforcement interaction, and you don't want to be on the receiving end of a police use of force. So you got to be able to read the room and recognize when the cop you're talking to is getting on an escalation ladder with you and figure out how to not jack it up, right? And second, understanding their framework, the cop framework, even if you're not a cop, even if it doesn't perfectly legally apply to you, might make you better at understanding and explaining your own framework as a civilian concealed carrier. And also for our military folks, does use of force apply? Well, yes and no, right? And when we're deployed, we have rules of engagement from the theater, special instructions. However, active duty guys who are performing civil support missions, use of force does apply. And that's governed by a DoD Directive 5210.56. And your individual service will also govern it with some reg, some Air Force instruction that if you're in that role, in that capacity of supporting civil authorities, then you gosh darn better know what your rules are for when you can escalate and de-escalate and what that even means. And it's different. Like we have a view of warning shots that Mike's agency probably doesn't have toward warning shots.
And, one of our other local agencies does, like our agency absolutely prohibits it.
Yeah.
I think the county where I work, the county in this area, I think they actually do in their policy allow it.
Huh.
Yeah. You'd have to fact check me on that. I don't know 100, but recently this came up and I think there are nearby agencies that allow it. So
that's a good example of like, it depends, right?
Well, and it brings up the next big thing, which is who and what determines these use of force laws and rules, and a whole bunch of people is the thing. You might be governed by several layers of this. And we talked about some of the different types of laws and directives that might come into play. We can't overlook also just public perception and your peers. If you are talking about a case and you think something was good to go and all of your peers are shutting you down, you might want to like really rethink it and see, hey, am I going about this the right way? So first and foremost, what determines use of force rules and laws starts with the Constitution. And not only the Constitution, but obviously the interpretation of the Constitution by the courts.
Yeah, so the Constitution is super clear that you as a citizen will not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The cops can't just kill you and take your stuff. That's what makes America great. That's what makes us a free country, is that and a bunch of other things, right? That's in the 7th Amendment, Bill of Rights. The 10th Amendment says we will not have any cruel or unusual punishment. Due process is a big, big deal in the government, right? The government is supposed to literally follow a formal process that gives you some protections, like a hearing and a lawyer and a jury. And those protections have to be proportionate to what they are putting you in jeopardy of losing, right? So the more I'm going to take from you, the more protections I have to give you as the government. So the point of all the legal stuff Mike's going to run you through starts with the idea that, generally speaking, the government isn't supposed to kill you. Generally speaking, the government isn't supposed to injure you or even detain you, even if you're guilty as sin, even if you really have it coming. They're not supposed to just do it for funsies, right? Unless it's within the bounds of the law and follows a legal process. You don't get to use force for fun, and if you do, that makes you the bad guys. And we don't want to be the bad guys, we want to be the good guys, right? Like, you ever seen the YouTube video reel, like, are we the baddies? It's like, well, this is the thing that makes you the baddies if you overstep. So when you do use force, I want you to use it unemotionally. I want you to use it intentionally, objectively, and to accomplish a goal. You're trying to get the guy to stop hurting people. You're trying to get the guy into cuffs. You're trying to execute a court order. You're trying to do a thing. And you're not just trying to hurt the guy for the sake of hurting the guy, right?
So that being said, most of your use of force stuff falls under the 4th Amendment. That is the search and seizure amendment, right? And we talked about the word reasonable. And interestingly, about due process is the use of force part is not really the due process part. That's the reasonableness. That is the stopping, the detaining, the arresting. And then due process becomes kind of a factor. We'll talk about some quotes for that. But in terms of interpretation of all of this stuff that Jim kind of listed out with some of the amendments and the legal stuff, when it comes to the 4th Amendment, most of your use of force stuff comes from Graham versus Garner. A little backstory. This incident happened in the 80s. And essentially, there was a guy, the cops were watching a store that was busy, lots going on, people coming in and out. It must have been a line inside. A guy walks into the store, but pulls up in a car driven by another dude, goes inside, turns around, comes right back outside. The officers thinking there's no way that guy went in there and did legitimate business. Maybe they just did a robbery. Maybe he went there and stole something. We're going to stop these dudes. Acting on that suspicion, They stop the dudes. They pull these guys out of the car, and one of them is acting up, and he ends up whooping his ass, right? Obviously, there's a big court proceeding that follows. There's a lawsuit, etc. The argument comes up that the guy was experiencing a diabetic problem. He felt like his blood sugar was getting low. He went inside because he was going to go try to get some juice or something to eat to bring his blood sugar back up, and that upon seeing how busy it was and how long it was going to take him to get through that line, thought, no, I can't. I'm not feeling good. I'm going to get back in the car and try somewhere else, is essentially the argument, right? And so this worked its way through the legal process as it was being judged in terms of use of force. And this part is important. What Graham versus Garner establishes is not whether or not that use of force was okay. That was left to the lower courts to say, hey, were the officers acting reasonable in this situation or not? What the Supreme Court said in Graham versus Garner was that the standard for measuring police use of force is whether or not it was objectively reasonable, and that it was judged by the view of the Fourth Amendment. Reasonable is a word that comes up in the Fourth Amendment, right? So a quote out of the case: the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight. The Fourth Amendment is not violated by an arrest based on probable cause, even though the wrong person is arrested, nor the mistaken execution of a valid search warrant on the wrong premises. With respect to a claim of excessive force, the same standard of reasonableness at the moment applies. Not every push or shove, even if it may later seem unnecessary in the peace of a judge's chambers, violates the Fourth Amendment. The calculus of reasonableness must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation. Another part of
So real quick, just the point of that is it gives cops some leeway, right? You don't have to perfectly know what's going on. You don't have to perfectly execute what you're doing. You've got a little bit of leeway from the courts.
Right.
But there's a big difference between a little bit of leeway and a lot of leeway.
Right.
Right.
But there are some key there's some key things there, right? Without the 20/20 vision of hindsight, and whether or not it was reasonable. Is it reasonable for the officer to think that, hey, that guy did not go in there and commit any legitimate business? It's reasonable to go have a contact with him, right? Continuing with another part of the case, as in other Fourth Amendment contexts, however, the reasonableness inquiry in an excessive force case is an objective one. The question is whether the officer's actions are objectively reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances confronting them, without regard to their underlying intent or motivation. An officer's evil intentions will not make a Fourth Amendment violation out of an objectively reasonable use of force, nor will an officer's good intentions make an objectively unreasonable use of force constitutional. So, guy goes into the store, is experiencing a diabetic emergency, needs to get some juice or something to bring his blood sugar up, goes back outside. The officers think there is some crime afoot. They go stop him. He puts up some level of resistance. We don't, whether that's because of a medical emergency or otherwise, we don't know. A use of force occurs. What this court case is establishing is not whether the officer or the individual was correct in what happened.
Or even whether they meant well.
Right.
The court doesn't give a shit.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because even if the cop thought, oh, I was doing the right thing, I really thought a crime happened. Well, that doesn't make whooping this guy's ass appropriate, right? Maybe. And I wasn't there. I don't know. But that is what this case establishes, is the standard by which it shall be judged.
And he had it coming isn't anywhere in there. That might be in a Texas Supreme Court ruling, but it's not in the federal Supreme Court ruling, right?
And so the other thing that this establishes is you don't have to be right. Like, I think this guy did something. I have objectively reasonable facts and circumstances that lead me to believe that I need to put this guy in handcuffs. I don't have to, it doesn't mean the person is guilty. Right? The due process part comes after, but I do have to be reasonable. I can detain somebody on suspicion for a crime and I can do an investigation and all of that stuff, but I do have to be reasonable even if I'm not correct. So where I see this come up a lot is when you explain, you have usually new cops like, hey, in training scenarios, obviously not real life, but training scenarios where you go, all right, class discussion, why'd you shoot that guy? And they blah, 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 blah. And they say something like, well, I was in fear for my life. It's like, well, that doesn't cut it. You being scared isn't what the use of force standard is. It is about being objectively reasonable through the lens of a reasonable person at the scene without the 20/20 vision of hindsight in situations that are tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving. So, yes, there is that leeway, but you still have to be reasonable. So that is your main use of force governing doctrine, is the U.S. Supreme Court decision in that case. And if you read through that case, which I encourage everyone to do, again, I'm not going to read it for you on the podcast. We're just kind of skimming the surface here. But what you will learn is there are 3 factors that they discuss in terms of use of force. 1 is the nature and severity of the crime. 2 is the level of danger or risk posed to the officers or members of the public. And 3 is whether the person is actively resisting arrest or attempting to flee on foot. That is kind of the 3-prong test that is discussed in Graham versus Garner. And those are the things that you should ground your decisions in when it comes to a use of force in that standard. So moving on with all of the places that use of force rules come from. And this is a list, so bear with us. We're kind of starting big picture and we're going to zoom in, obviously. You've got some differences between state guidelines and state laws and federal laws and federal guidelines, right? Now, the federal law enforcement, the feds, are charged with enforcing laws on certain things, the very specific list of things, and the rest of things are left to the states.
The 12th Amendment.
It's a constitutional law class is what it's turning into.
Oh, yeah.
So part of the makeup of our system is that different people in different states and different places have different wants and different needs. And our republic was designed in such a way that the federal government is limited and the states have the right to govern themselves how they see fit, in accordance with federal law and the Constitution, obviously. But it sets up some additional layers, like different playbooks, kind of. So the feds still have to play by the rules as far as the Constitution and the courts are concerned, but the local guys have another set of rules.
And specifically an additional set of rules on top of that. Yeah.
So that takes us down to state law. So there are some federal stuff. We'll come back to that. That takes us to state law. So most of your everyday crime stuff, those are matters left to the states. That's like your, generally speaking, things like rape and murder and theft and robbery. Most of those things are left to the state, right? There are federal laws that there's some crossover. There are certain federal laws that apply in certain contexts. So, for example, most banks in the United States are federally insured. So when a bank robbery occurs, there is still a federal interest in that case. It is usually prosecuted at the state level, but if you get someone that's going around knocking banks, or especially if they're doing it between states, then the feds are going to get involved in cases like that. But you always at least involve or notify them usually in something like that. So there is some crossover in some circumstances, but for the most part, the states get to govern themselves in that sense, right? So generally speaking, everything from murder to assault is governed by the state. And that means it's also, generally speaking, up to the states to say whether something like a murder or an assault is justified or defensible. So a police officer who is a citizen who assaults or murders another citizen using force during the course of their job is subject to those state laws.
And that's an important point that people kind of mess up. So when there's a bad shoot, there's usually a cry from the masses like, string them up. And it's like, hang on. Every scoundrel gets a trial, right? And as soon as you put the weight of the government against a person in a prosecution, that person then has rights as a suspect, right? That police officer has rights as a suspect, has Fifth Amendment rights. That's kind of a big deal, right? And I feel like people forget that on both sides of the argument. Like cops, I think sometimes forget that. They forget that they are also subject to all this.
And that they are the weight of the government.
Yeah.
They forget the big picture piece that they play in that.
Yeah. And I think citizens in general, the masses, also forget that. Like, hey, we don't get to just string people up because we don't like what they did on camera. Like, no, there's a process, a due process, right?
Yeah. So speaking of the federal side, there are also laws that address things like the power or authority of the government against its citizens, right? That comes up in the Constitution. So it's also a federal matter. And so that includes things like civil rights violations. So back to those constitutional things, right? That both the state and federal laws will regulate and apply when it comes to use of force. And while they will vary from state to state, there is at least some degree of consistency across the states because of those boundaries that Jim talked about earlier. Speaking of those boundaries and kind of that federal involvement in things, there's another court case that is important to consider for use of force. This is a case, the event itself happened in the mid-70s, Tennessee versus Garner. And this addresses an example of a state law that was found to be unconstitutional. And it came before Graham versus Conner, but it sort of provided some of the framework for Graham versus Conner. In this case, a teenager, a juvenile, was seen after a burglary occurred, basically running away and jumping a fence. And the cops were operating under a Tennessee state law at the time that said a fleeing felon can be stopped with lethal force. Pretty vague, pretty broad there. And so a burglary being a felony crime, this person was running from, he shot this kid in the back, killed him dead. That is the story of Tennessee versus Garner in a nutshell. Problematic, obviously, but this was the 70s, so keep that in context. And out of that court case, the U.S. Supreme Court said the Fourth Amendment should not be construed in light of the common law rule allowing the use of whatever force is necessary to effect the arrest of a fleeing felon. The use of deadly force to prevent the escape of all felony suspects, whatever the circumstances, is constitutionally unreasonable. It is not better that all felony suspects die than that they escape. Where the suspect poses no immediate threat to the officer and no threat to others, the harm resulting from failing to apprehend him does not justify the use of deadly force to do so. It is no doubt unfortunate when a suspect who is in sight escapes, but the fact that the police arrive a little late or are a little slower afoot does not always
hit the gym.
Yeah. Does not always justify killing the suspect. A police officer may not seize an unarmed, non-dangerous suspect by shooting him dead. The Tennessee statute is unconstitutional insofar as it authorizes the use of deadly force against such fleeing suspects. Now,
yeah, we don't get to deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It's a thing.
Right, because you stole something, right?
Or you might have stolen something. I haven't proven that yet, right?
Also important. Mm-hmm. So, it does clarify, though, it is not, however, unconstitutional on its face, where the officer has probable cause to believe that the suspect poses a threat of serious physical harm, either to the officer or to others. It is not constitutionally unreasonable to prevent escape by using deadly force. Thus, if the suspect threatens the officer with a weapon, or there is probable cause to believe that he has committed a crime involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious physical harm, deadly force may be used if necessary to prevent escape, and if, where feasible, some warning has been given. So, this guy's on a citywide crime spree. He's carjacking people. He's shooting at people. He's shot at the cops. Like, we've had stuff like this. And now you see him running across the street. Can you take that guy out? Maybe. That's what that's saying. So it's not to say that just because it's a fleeing felon, there's not a justification available. It's saying that you can't just use that blanket rule. In other words, you got to use some common sense and some critical thinking. Now, this case, Tennessee versus Garner, specifically addressed the standard for the use of deadly force, right? So this is talking about not only the Tennessee state statute at the time, but it is also laying the framework for what later became Graham versus Conner. But it's saying, hey, deadly force is reasonable in these circumstances. If there is serious physical harm, threat to the officers or to others, and you think that's how you have to stop them, then that could be okay. It came up in Graham versus Garner, this quote that I'm about to read, it basically expanded that to all uses of force and kind of clarified it, right? So from Graham versus Garner, today we make explicit what was implicit in Garner's analysis and hold that all claims that law enforcement officers have used excessive force, deadly or not, in the course of an arrest, investigatory stop, or other seizure of a free citizen should be analyzed under the Fourth Amendment and its reasonableness standard rather than under a substantive due process approach. Because the Fourth Amendment provides an explicit textual source of constitutional protection against this sort of physical intrusive government conduct, that amendment and not the more generalized notion of substantive due process must be the guide for analyzing these claims. So what does that mean for us? What we're saying is that the due process thing, I can't have the trial at 2:00 in the morning when the crimes are occurring, right? I have to make that stop, make that arrest, do that investigation. To some degree, I am allowed to do that if I am objectively reasonable. That is what allows you
to search and seize. Just to be clear, that's what Fourth Amendment is: search and seize. People are secure in their persons and effects unless there's a warrant or probable cause, right? That's what this is.
Right. And one thing that we haven't gotten into here at all are the court cases related to probable cause, reasonable suspicion, right? The thresholds where you're allowed to make an arrest or to stop somebody. Different topic for a different day. We're talking like, yeah. But all we're talking about here is the use of force part of it, but it's to establish that if you have reached that threshold of probable cause, right? That is your due process, right? Once you have it, though, your use of force is judged by these standards. Okay, enough of that. That is what the courts say. Generally speaking, those are the two big Supreme Court cases that deal with use of force. Now, there's a whole bunch of local and regional stuff that you have to consider here too, right? You've got the appellate courts. Now, this is important because the appellate courts kind of regionalize the country, right? At the federal level. And once these get out of the state's hands and into the appellate courts, where you live in which circuit does affect a little bit more of you, right? In terms of like, I live in an area governed by the Ninth Circuit, so I should pay attention to what the Ninth Circuit is ruling on stuff like this. Now, they do share notes, though. So it really gets murky because it matters what region of the country you're in, but also, the Supreme Court could step in at some point and say, we disagree with that decision, right? So it's just something to kind of just keep an eye on. There's also department policy stuff, right? So we already talked about state and federal laws. We talked about some of the court cases. The appellate courts might sneak their way into there at different times. And then you have all the way down to that local level, usually your department policy stuff. Generally speaking, department policies are going to be the most restrictive when it comes to use of force. Now, breaking department policy is also not against the law. So you
might get you fired, probably not going to get you arrested.
Right. So this is important because there might be situations that you skirt around the policy. It's not a good look, right? But what potentially do you give up? It's the protection with your agency that comes with it, right? So it's not illegal to break the policy, but it is not in your best interest, generally speaking. Now, there are cases where your policy is not going to cover everything and you're going to have to make your decisions like a grown-up. So keep that in mind. But for the most part, your department policies are going to be applied based on local preferences. So you have mayor and council, or you have figureheads, right? Sheriffs and chiefs that are going to have, input from the communities, i.e. the voters, when they write their policies. And they're generally most restrictive. We're going to come back to what policy looks like on this stuff in a few minutes. Another thing that I want to hit in terms of local stuff is customs and practices. Customs and practices, other words you can use for this are things like traditions and routines. So this is like, well, yeah, that policy is there, but no one really follows it, right? Yeah, the policy says you're allowed to do X, but like no one really listens to that. That's still going to come up, right? These are the kind of the unwritten norms, the cultural stuff. even things like tactics and a lot of officer safety stuff in terms of like where I'm going to position people and how I order people out of a house or a car and things like that. Like a lot of that stuff's not written down anywhere, right? But there are norms, unwritten norms, customs and practices that could come up. And sometimes this is a matter of efficiency and convenience. And sometimes it's just a matter of like, you lose sight of a lot of the policy stuff. Sometimes they're just old. They're outdated. No one's taken the effort to sit there and write it down. It's hard to update. It's hard to capture everything in writing. Who knows? There's a number of reasons that this can happen. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because standard operating procedures and policies are one thing. But if we disregard them all the time, they don't really help us. And I'm not saying that you need to write down the answer to every single question in a policy somewhere. What I am saying is that they should jive with each other. They should be consistent enough to say, yeah, this practice, this custom, this standard operating procedure, it fits within the policy, right? It makes sense. These do come up in court. In fact, like fairly frequently. I think attorneys will, because they know that, like they're not dumb. And if you are out of policy, but quote unquote, this is how we've always done it, right? Whether you're just ignorant of the policy, you forgot about it, you didn't, whatever.
We're going to pull that thread in court.
Yeah.
We're going to hash that out.
And right? It doesn't matter that the policy was written in 1984 before you were probably even born. An attorney is going to dress that up as they please.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind.
Policy compliance, one, keeps you on the payroll, one, and two, what it really gets you is some legitimacy and hopefully some institutional backing from your agency where your sheriff, your chief is like, yeah, he was doing the thing we told him to do, right? And it gives you a stronger case that what you were doing was reasonable because it was within the window, right? It was within custom, within your scope of training to do X.
So what that leads us is to what that policy looks like. When it comes to use of force stuff, in a well-intended effort to codify and guide the members of the organization, department leaders are typically going to provide some kind of written policy or material about use of force. And this is really, really difficult because there's so much to account for in policy, right? And how do you write down everything? And if you write 60 pages of shit, how are you going to make sure everyone remembers and applies all of that in every situation they encounter, every time they pull a car over or stop a dude behind a Circle K or something like that, right? Think about all those quotes in Graham B. Conner, right? Without 20/20 vision of hindsight, situations that are tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving, not every push and shove. I mean, how do you write that into your policy? I mean, you shouldn't have to. The court case is established for you, right? But
well, you have a pushing policy, you have a shoving policy, you have a hindsight policy. It's good. Yeah,
exactly.
That'll solve all your problems.
It's difficult, right? How do you write a policy that accounts for every single possible factor? Well, it was dark outside, or it was the weather was hot, or the weather was cold. Those things matter. We'll talk about more of those factors in a little bit. How do you make sure that reasonable people agree? Here's a hint. You don't. Reasonable minds will differ. And so if you get a really, really like risk averse person in a position making decisions or judgments about uses of force, and then you get someone who's they're a crime fighter, they're a go-getter, and they're out there stirring stuff up, kicking the bushes, and they use force to do their job. How do you make sure that that person is being appropriately managed? Right? On both ends of the spectrum, in a don't go off the rails, son, but also like you're allowed to do your job. How do you account for that, right? How many pages of policy do you write before it gets too much to memorize or keep track of? I kind of mentioned that, right? Like I'm face to face with an offender. Like I can't, you know what? On page 37, it says like, that's not going to work. I can't apply that in real life. It's very, very impractical. And remember that writing is linear, right? Like writing in and of itself, like there's a top of a page and the bottom of a page. You have to read it in a certain order. And real life doesn't happen that way also. There's things that I might be hearing in my earpiece on my radio or things that might be going on around me as I'm face to face with this guy. All of that stuff is happening concurrently, right? It's really hard to write chronologically stuff like this. And so how do I make a policy that fits that, right?
You draw a little pyramid. That solves all your problems, right?
Right. So I have a diagram. That's cool.
Yeah.
So the reality of this situation is that making good decisions and stuff like this boils down to critical thinking, experience, and training. None of that occurs on a PDF or a Word doc or in like a chart or a diagram. And what has happened over the years is departments are trying to get this right. And again, it's a well-intended effort. We're trying to give guidance and keep everybody out of trouble, but still do our jobs, right? But we've come up with things like these escalation ladders or like levels of force, which again, just think about the way that you read levels of force. It implies that it is one thing, then the other thing, then the other thing in some sort of order, right? And if you put them in a weird order, that's just going to confuse people. So, or we use a continuum, right? Where you have like arrows that kind of do the same thing. It's a linear way of thinking. And just the way that is written, regardless of how you explain it, will suggest that you had to do one thing and then the next. And a lot of times we actually talked about it that way. When it came to unwritten norms and the customs and practices thing, we used to say, ask, tell, make. We've talked about that a bunch of times on this show. We'd say, first I'm going to ask them, then I'm going to tell them, then I'm going to make them. Hey, sir, would you mind turning around, put your hands behind your back for me? Turn around, put your hands behind your back right now. And then we're going hands on, right? I done told them once, it was the law enforcement equivalent of because I said so. And we'd think it was reasonable and justified to work our way up that ladder because, hey, I did the one thing, and so I'm justified in doing the next thing, right? Regardless of all kinds of other circumstances that could be at play. The other thing that you'd see is people would underreact to resistance or threats because they're like, oh, well, I have to do the ask and the tell before I can make them. And there might be circumstances where you don't have time to ask and tell, you just need to make, right? Like because someone's life might depend on it. Maybe even the offender. So we don't want people to do ask and then tell if they think that they just need to jump to make. So this is hard. And models like that, policy and rules, will get in people's head. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have models and policies and rules, to be clear. They're obviously important, but they do have an impact. And one of the problems with some of these older ways of thinking is just that they're too rigid and they don't account for all the variables.
I totally agree with what Mike just said, but I got to jump in on ask, tell, make, because in my mind, it's a good example of how a good idea can get warped over generations of trainers doing the telephone game. How it went from a very elegant, eloquent explanation in its original form, and over the years got turned into this like checklist. It's not a checklist, right? And I think that gets to the heart of what we're really trying to accomplish in use of force and in discussing use of force. The point of ask, tell, make from the verbal judo or gerbil voodoo training program was to break cops back in the day of the habit of, like bad parenting, like ask, lose your shit, overreact, right? They were trying to make cops less emotional when they weren't dealing with a compliant subject, right? When we were dealing with contempt of cop, what do we do? Okay.
It was also about like, hey, if asking isn't working, like at some point you need to change your approach and maybe tell.
Yeah.
And
it was to encourage a more dynamic approach instead of a less dynamic, rigid approach, right?
Yeah, but also say that like, hey, you have to draw a line and have initiative of the situation, right? Like at some point you need to start dictating the event and not them.
Yeah. And the point is to start when you can with a calm, professional tone and understand that you're trying to lead in a situation and that humans, universally, would rather be asked than told. Then you tell them in a clear and unequivocal manner. And then, under your control and with a deliberate amount of force to achieve the thing you're trying to achieve, you force the situation, but you do it under control. That's a good thing, and it's an important thing to understand, but it's not a checklist.
And that was the problem when we taught it, right? Was you would explain all that, but what would they walk out of the room with? Because when you're standing face to face with the offender, you don't remember the 45-minute podcast Mike and Jim talking about that thing. You remember ask, tell, make. And that's what steers your decisions. It's just not nuanced enough. So unfortunately for all of us, I suppose, there's this big think tank called...
Oh, thank God. The think tank is here.
No. So to be clear, nothing is wrong with PERF. That's not where I'm going with this. The Police Executive Research Forum is, fortunately, they made a model for us called the critical decision making model. And that's cool. We're going to talk about its limitations though, obviously. Now, like all models, it's just not that simple. Right. And so we understand they're inherently flawed. This is a much better approach, 100%, than the stuff in the past. But it's still a lot to take in. But there's a specific thing that I like about it, and we'll get to that. Okay. But to back up just a little bit, PERF back in 2005, which was like almost 20 years ago, said that use of force continuums do not accurately reflect the dynamic nature of potentially violent situations in which the entire range of officer, subject, and force options must constantly be assessed throughout the course of the interaction. Kind of what we were just saying, right? They've been saying that for 20 years. And yet, like I said, not talking trash on PERF, they've been saying this for 20 years, and yet a lot of agencies still have this shit written in their policies.
Yep.
Take a hint, guys. Like, so if you take anything from this podcast, maybe reconsider some of that, because this model actually is good. It's just funny. And we'll talk about why. So after Ferguson, which was 2014, PERF came out with this CDM model, critical decision-making model, which was a concept that they stole from the UK. The UK's version of this was called the National Decision Model. And I think that's probably the funniest part of the story, actually, that we stole this from the Brits. But that notwithstanding, I'm taking this mostly right off the PERF website. The CDM teaches officers to start asking themselves the following types of questions as soon as they get a call. What do I know about what is happening at the scene of this call? Is there a history of previous calls at this location? What do we now know about the person who made this call? Is there any indication of mental health issues at this call? Is there a person with a weapon at the scene? And then, after arriving at the scene, officers are taught to keep asking questions as they work through a 5-step process. This is the part that I love. Number 1, collect information. Number 2, assess the situation, threats, and risks. Number 3, consider police powers and police policy or agency policy. 4, identify options and determine the best course of action. 5, act, review, and reassess. Man, where have I ever heard such a thing? It sounds remarkably similar to observe, orient, decide, and act. Go freaking figure. I love this. It's great. There is also a central theme that sort of surrounds those 5 steps that they list and the questions, right? And they account for things like ethics, values, and the sanctity of human life. Now, I would argue that if you read OODA Loop in its truest form, your orientation is what steers the entire process. And because your orientation steers the entire process, that accounts for all of those things. And so the consider police powers and agency policy and all of that, I think, accounting for ethics, values, and sanctity of human life, I think that is still OODA Loop. I think orientation, your moral compass, your orientation, your OODA Loop is different than the offenders. The people making the decisions as criminal offenders are operating from a different place than most police officers out there. And that is because that is a product of their orientation, right? And that accounts also for training experience, department policy, laws, ethics, all of that. So I do think this is just kind of rewritten, polished up version of the OODA Loop, which is kind of funny to me.
I'd really like step 3, consider police powers and agency policy. Like, I'm walking up to a scene, like I'm pretending to be Mike, right? I've got my dog barking in the back seat. I've got a podcast playing in my ear, whatever it is I do. I walk up and there's this dude just beating the snot out of his domestic partner, just really wailing. Maybe he's about to grab a brick. And I'm like, hang on. What are police powers? What's the meaning of police powers and agency policy right now? What does page 38 of the my agency SOP say right now? bullshit.
Well, and this is part of the reason I laugh when I joke about like, well, fortunately, someone made a model for us.
Yeah.
It's because one of the fundamental things about OODA is that like implicit guidance and control piece.
Yeah.
Right?
I got to make fun of this a little bit more, though. Is there any indication of a mental health issue at this call? Like, it's 3 a.m. It's a naked woman, 300 pounds, covered in her own poop. Like, I don't know. Maybe, probably.
Well, and like, here again, I gotta give credit to Perf because they're trying to help agencies that are stuck in the Stone Age and still have use of force continuums, even though they said that's a bad idea since 2005. Right? Like, yeah. So
fair.
Thank God they finally came up with something like, here, we'll do it for you. but then they dressed up the OODA loop in a sense, right? And like added steps to it, as if I go to a call and think to myself, I'm observing right now. I'm going to stand by while I orient myself. Okay, now let's decide. Like, that's not how decision-making works.
It's fair, though, that we should be thoughtful about how we respond to calls. Like, okay, yeah, cool. It's a model, right? And anytime we talk models, I always want to reinforce all models are flawed. Some models are useful for understanding a concept. And the concept, in my mind, what they're trying to push is, yes, you have an OODA loop. Also, when you respond to a call, be a little inquisitive. Like, what do we know right now? What are my options right now? That's a reasonable thing, and I do applaud them for that. I'm still going to make fun of them, though.
I like the effort. It is much better than what we had. I'm not disputing that. I think it misses a very important point, though. Use of force decisions don't get made in a 5-step process. That's not how that happens. You perceive things, you respond to those things. You do have a choice in how you respond to those things, and we need to teach people how to like embrace that subconsciously a little bit. But that is a much bigger thing than what the model can accomplish, right? That is outside of the scope of what the model says. And so that's why I just think it's kind of funny. It's like, oh yeah, that's what we need is more steps, more steps to the process. Anyway, it is a good effort. I'm not talking shit. I just think it's kind of funny. They Perf builds on the critical decision-making model with ICAT. They basically talk about integrating communications, assessment, and tactics. In a nutshell, what they're saying is like, you got to see the big picture responding to situations that might involve force and break down the silos between the tactical stuff, just the tactics, right? And also things like crisis intervention, negotiations, like you need the tactics and all of that need to be integrated and built in with everything else. And again, I think that is the correct answer, right? It's how we do that. Therein lies the rub. That's what makes it a lot harder. So I get it. They wanted this to be more comprehensive than OODA, and that's good. So fine, here we are. Now we have this neat diagram, and it looks like it accounts for all the things that you want it to account for, but you have to tie it into your day-to-day still. You've got to run training that exposes people to the edges of their capabilities and their comfort zones and challenges them. Scenarios where afterwards, like scenarios that they're able to mess up, right? That I don't want to say they're encouraged to mess up. They should be winnable. However, they should challenge people, right? They shouldn't always be a win. If I always make it easy, then I'm never going to have a chance to be like, all right, let's back up and figure out where things went wrong, right? And then we can use that model to sort of deconstruct some of it and figure out what they missed or what they failed to consider. And on a day-to-day basis, you can apply this to like your debriefs after calls, really dig into this stuff and go piece by piece through this model and use it as a tool to make sure that you're actually thinking about it all every day, right? Don't leave it buried in the manual that you're never going to look at again. It doesn't help you there. All right, so what are some elements and factors that we have to tie into use of force stuff? Some of the things that the courts and others, based on interpretation of the court's rulings, have talked about when it comes to this practical application side, and that is the elements of force, right? Essentially, there are a few questions that a use of force should address.
My boot, your ass.
Yeah. Those questions boil down to ability, opportunity, jeopardy, and preclusion. What is the person's physical ability to harm me or somebody else? Do they actually possess that capability, right? A weapon, hands and feet, whatever it is. Do they have the physical ability? Do they have the opportunity to harm me or someone else right now? So I'm threatening someone, but they're over there across the room and they're saying, I'm going to kick your ass, right? Can they get to me? And do they have that opportunity right now? That's a question that needs to be asked, right? Jeopardy. Am I or anyone else in any actual danger right this second? So that person has a gun in a holster. He has the ability, he has the opportunity to shoot me because we're standing within range of that pistol, but it's in the holster. Am I in any danger right this minute? Now there's room to say that, well, he could probably draw and shoot in X amount of time, and that could be the case, but you have to factor that in with everything else, right? The ability and opportunity piece all kind of get taken in context of the situation. A gun in a holster could be problematic, but it might not be, right? It's a factor. But the point is, there has to be some danger, and you also need to account for the immediacy of that danger, right? And then preclusion. Are there other or lesser options available? And if so, were they attempted or would they be effective? And if not, why? Preclusion is maybe the most important piece here when it comes to practice in my mind. Now, ability, opportunity, and jeopardy, those things are kind of easy, right? Like at the end of the day, if they're there, they're there. But someone is still always going to ask, well, why didn't you just X? That's an important question. You better be ready to answer. Why didn't you just shoot him in the leg? Why didn't you just shoot him in the arm? Well, there's a good explanation for that. Here's what it is. Why didn't you give a warning shot? Why didn't you walk away? Why didn't you do nothing, right? There's some case law on this too, and it's important. We talked about those continuums, like levels of force, how that's just too linear, right? It's written like a ladder. It's problematic, right? The idea is that you have options and you can choose from those options. That is what preclusion boils down to, is there are always usually options, right? There's a really helpful Seventh Circuit case on this, Placas versus Drinsky. And I think it's from the early 90s, if I remember right. I'm not going to...
Placas versus Drinsky's, obviously. Seventh Circuit. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's from the early 90s, I think, like 93, 94, something like that. And I'm not going to dive into the story and stuff. I just want to read a couple quotes that I think are really helpful out of this case. One is, there is no precedent in this circuit or any other which says that the Constitution requires law enforcement officers to use all feasible alternatives to avoid a situation where deadly force can be justifiably used. There are, however, cases which support the assertion that where deadly force is otherwise justified under the Constitution, there is no constitutional duty to use non-deadly alternatives first. So think about that. If deadly force is justified, then deadly force is justified, right? Continuing with the court case, the Fourth Amendment does not require officers to use the least intrusive or even less intrusive alternatives in search and seizure cases. The only test is whether what the police officers actually did was reasonable. And there's another quote in here that I thought was particularly helpful and important because we talked about the option to do nothing. And I thought this made some good points, right? Our historical emphasis on the shortness of the legally relevant time period is not accidental. The time frame is a crucial aspect in excessive force cases. Other than random attacks, all such cases begin with the decision of a police officer to do something, to help, to arrest, to inquire. If the officer had decided to do nothing, then no force would have been used. In this sense, the police officer always causes the trouble. But it is trouble which the police officer is sworn to cause, which society pays him to cause, and which, if kept within constitutional limits, society praises the officer for causing. I think that's really helpful, right? Because we are going to cause trouble. Right? We are going to cause injury and force. It's part of the job. It's part of what you do. And I also think that this is really helpful because it discusses the element of time in use of force decision making, whether you had time or not, and what that time costs you. Without going into all of the case details, there was a case that happened here in where I live involving a guy in a motorized wheelchair. And he had been seen up and out of the wheelchair walking around. He had a knife that was brandished to someone. He committed some low-level offense, but threatened someone with the knife. And he leaves and starts wheeling his way in his electric scooter or wheelchair or whatever towards an open business. And there's a police officer trying to stop him, telling him, stop, you need to stop. And he doesn't stop. And he eventually makes it to the front of another store where there's another lady standing. And the officer knows that he's already been able to get up and out of that wheelchair. He's got a knife. And so he ends up in a situation where now he feels obligated to shoot this guy. So he uses deadly force. And this is difficult, right? Because if he had used less force any time across the parking lot, that probably still wouldn't look good, right? You could tase the guy, you could knock over his wheelchair maybe, you could do any number of things. You're still going to be the guy that did whatever in the wheelchair. Now, to be clear, I don't like this shooting at all, right? Like, I think it was avoidable. However, what you have to think about here is like, your window of time that you had to do something else was closing. And now you're at the point where, shit, like he has access to innocent people now. Am I gonna kill him for that? Right? So there's time that you have and there's time that you don't, and the window closes. And I'm not going to deep dive that case because I think there's still some ongoing litigation. And obviously I've got some awareness of some of that. So we're going to leave it at that.
There's a recurring theme here, and you see it in law enforcement stuff, you see it in military stuff, you see it in civilian stuff, of underreacting early tends to drive having to overreact late.
Right. And that's kind of where I'm going with this, is that like time is a factor you have to account for. And if you have time, a window of time, and that window closes, what does it cost you? Time matters, and you really got to think about that too. So anyway, when it comes to other options, there are situations where you don't have any time and you can't use other options. You have to jump straight to something. Factor that in, right? So that's ability, opportunity, jeopardy, and preclusion. Ability, the physical ability to inflict harm. Opportunity, are we standing in a place where that harm can be inflicted? Jeopardy, am I in any actual danger right this minute? What's the immediacy of that danger? And then preclusion, what options are available to me and why weren't they used or effective? So those are the elements of force. Another set of questions, especially in the context of law enforcement, is what's the lawful purpose? Why are you using force? And Jim talked about this earlier. What is your objective or your goal here? What are you trying to accomplish? Is it to effect an arrest? To overcome some level of resistance? Is it to prevent someone from escaping? Is it to prevent the destruction of evidence? To stop or prevent a crime? To prevent injury or serious injury or death to myself or to somebody else? This is important because, and this came up in those court cases, right? The nature of, is the person a danger to the officer or others, right? Graham v. Garner. And also Tennessee v. Garner. It comes up in both cases. Sometimes I'm not at risk or in danger, but because of my lawful authority, I'm going to use force to seize and stop a person. And it's not about the danger necessarily to me. It is about my lawful authority to effect that arrest. But we want to be very, very clear about that when we use force and we make those decisions, and also when we document those things, right? The risk to the offender matters. And this is where, when you talk about that critical decision-making model, you talked about the sanctity of human life. Think back to the quote in Tennessee v. Garner that says, just because it's a fleeing felon doesn't mean we get to shoot him dead, right? That is still a person. They still have rights. You don't get to just kill them. You have to tailor your response in a proportional way.
Yeah, proportional comes up a lot when we're talking about use of force, right? And society as a whole gets pretty freaking outraged when cops kill a guy for selling like loose cigarettes. Well, how come you killed him? He was just selling loose cigarettes. And the answer is, yeah, that use of force was disproportionate to the crime they were dealing with. But also, anytime we as citizens say there ought to be a law, what we're saying is we want the cops to go apply force to people who aren't complying with it, right? You are creating a condition where cops have to go apply force. That's what you're doing when you're voting for and there ought to be a law. So think about that when you're voting. To put the what are we trying to accomplish thing in military terms I understand, I think of the words deterrence and coercion. In deterrence, you're trying to convince someone not to do a thing. Don't invade Ukraine or bad things will happen. I will impose a cost on you that you cannot afford. Coercion is when you apply force to convince someone to do a thing. Hey, Saddam, leave Kuwait, or I'm going to crank up the pain until you no longer feel like you have a choice. Okay? Deterrence and coercion. Throughout all of this, what we're really trying to do is lead someone who doesn't want to be led. Right? I asked them, I told them, and now I'm making them. Okay? And we are way on one side of the leadership spectrum, the transactional side of leadership spectrum in the full range leadership model that I was taught in school, where I am using my biggest carrots and my biggest sticks. And just think of it in the context, you're trying to lead someone to an end state, into handcuffs, into the back of the car, out of the car, get their feet into the car. Whatever it is you're trying to get them to do, that's what you're doing. You're leading.
Absolutely. Another concept and use of force, speaking of some of what Jim said, is when it comes to provocation. There was a case that came up and it was overturned by the Supreme Court, but essentially these cops were confronting a suicidal guy and they went into his bedroom where he was armed with a knife. So he was in his room by himself. No one else was in any danger, and they inserted themselves into this problem. And then the guy, came up with a knife and they shot and killed him. Right? I can't remember if he died or not, but they shot him for sure. In any case, the argument was made that, the officer shouldn't have gone in there. They wouldn't have to shoot the guy. They wouldn't have been in danger. He wouldn't have been in any danger other than to himself. And so essentially that because they provoked the situation, it was their fault. Now, the courts disagreed with that. They said it's not about what led up to it. It's in the moments that the force was used, whether or not the use of force was justified. Because it's a slippery slope to say that all these other things leading up to it maybe puts us in a situation where if I didn't, go to the gym at 2:00 last Tuesday, then this other thing wouldn't have happened on Friday morning. It's a slippery slope, right? And so they went back to kind of the staples of Graham v. Conner and stuff like that and said, no, at the time that force was used is the standard. And at the time the force was used, they were standing face to face with a guy with a gun. Now, that's not to say that other things didn't go sideways as far as that goes, but the Supreme Court kind of tossed the provocation stuff. That being said, there's still a matter of public perception and good tactics and officer safety and all of those things. And I think the main reason I bring this up, one is to address what Jim said earlier. I talked about the guy in the wheelchair. Lesser force earlier on would have prevented having to shoot that guy, most likely, I would say. Maybe not, but odds are good that at least you could say you tried all these other things first, right? Instead of just waited, and then now all of a sudden I feel like I have to shoot the person. Now, I don't know that guy needed to be shot still anyway, but that's besides the point. But the other thing that it brings up is that it's one thing to say that I followed the rules and I was legally justified and within policy. That is not the only thing that should be driving your decisions. Taking unnecessary risks for you and the suspect, you don't want to be in a situation where now I have to shoot this guy if I can avoid it, right? We have to avoid that. The sanctity of human life piece, right? Public perception matters. Don't be famous on YouTube. Don't take unnecessary risks. Think about all the times that you could justify the use of force, but how many times do you want to expose yourself to the risk that comes with that? Not just the Like, yeah, the physical risk, sure, the danger, but also having to sell it, right? Having to justify it, having to take it to court and all of that. So it's not just about law and legal stuff. It's also about good tactics and good decision-making. Be a professional.
Yeah. I want you in control. I want you in control of the situation to the point where you're not in those positions. Where I see this come up is when a cop either jumps in front of or happens to be standing in front of a suspect's car. The suspect isn't trying to kill the cop. He's trying to get away from the cop. But this creates a situation where the suspect is now presenting a deadly threat. Is use of force against that suspect justifiable when he starts revving the engine and puts it in drive? Yeah, it is justifiable. Is it smart? No. And in my experience, both cops and the public hate that. They hate the gray area of lawful but awful, right? We want it to either be totally righteous or totally first-degree murder. Well, your use of force might be defensible, as in like someone can make a case why it was justified, and you may not get prosecuted for it or you may not get convicted. But even if you make it through the legal stuff, if it degrades the standing of police in the community and leaves everyone, including you, feeling shitty, that's not a win.
No, it's not. And also, even if the guy was trying to kill you with the car, this is the other thing, is there's still a physics issue there. The math ain't mathin' in that situation, right? Like, maybe he is trying to come at you, so you're going to stand there and shoot at him or get the hell out of the way. Like, it is still a better approach to get out of, like, you can't stop the car that's now going 20, 30 miles an hour or whatever it is. Like, you could shoot the guy in the face. It's not going to make the car immediately stop. Your efforts and attention should still be focused on getting out of the way. So it's just kind of it's a dumb thing to begin with. Now, I'm not saying there's not circumstances where it would fit or it would be okay, but it definitely should not be the default. One other thing that I want to make sure that we account for here when it comes to use of force decision making is that we establish your safety priorities. So we've got the elements of force. You've got the big preclusion piece that we talked about, the lawful purpose, whether or not we want to provoke anybody and what good tactics and stuff might look like. But all of that should be grounded in the priorities of life or safety priorities, if sometimes interchangeable names have changed a little bit. And what that boils down to is, like, number one, as public servants, we are there to protect hostages and or victims of crimes, right? Like, that's a big part of our goal, and our ethos is to save lives. And so they are usually at the top of our list, the hostage or the victim. And then we owe the public and the people that we serve we owe it to them to also protect them. So bystanders and innocent third parties, they're number two. Number three are the officers. You guys are out there doing the job, and you deserve to be a priority in safety because you're out there doing things lawfully and to your best abilities, right? The suspects fall at the bottom of that list. So where this comes into is if you've got a guy who is suicidal, homicidal, something like that. Now, if they're only a danger to themselves, then they're only a danger to themselves, right? But they're a danger to other people, then their safety is lower of a priority than the innocent third party or the potential access to hostages and victims, and even to the officers if we can't avoid it otherwise, right? You need to ground your decision making in, like, who are we trying to protect? And I've seen a lot of scenarios where we're trying to contain this guy. We want to use less force. We don't want to have to shoot him, but if we expose other people in the process, including ourselves, then our priorities are misplaced. So everything should be grounded in those safety priorities. The hostages and the victims, number one. Number two, bystanders or innocent third parties. Number three, officer safety comes next, right? We're below members of the public in most cases because we're the ones that signed up to do this thing, right? And then the suspect at the bottom of that list. Now, importantly, you can also throw evidence on this list because a lot of people have justified using force to prevent the destruction of evidence. And it's just noteworthy to point out that evidence is below the safety of a suspect. It's just to list that on there. Another thing that I want to point out this is obviously something that is near and dear to my heart, you'll notice that a canine, a dog, is nowhere on this list. The dog is a tool. He's a piece of property. I get it. He's a living being, and everyone wants to see people who harm police animals with, they want the full weight of the law. I get it. I understand. But you cannot justify killing a person who is harming a dog. That is still a person, right? And so this has come up a number of times where in scenarios and sometimes in real life, like a dog is, and I've had a police dog get stabbed before, and people are like, well, I would shoot the guy if he was stabbing my dog. That's not okay, right? Like you don't get to, now if you're in some sort of danger, if the guy's got a gun and killing the dog is now going to present the opportunity for him to use the gun towards you, that's a different story, right? Assuming you're within range of that thing. If you are in danger, you can use it in self-defense or in defense of a third party, absolutely. But you cannot protect the dog, if that makes sense. Doesn't mean you can't use force, but you can't justify killing somebody over it. Okay, so how do I apply this stuff in use of force decisions? Other than running you through a bunch of scenarios and stuff, it would be really difficult to try to talk through all of this. But I do think the documentation is important. And one of the things that I can maybe do to help you here apply this in real life is to talk through more or less how I write a report after a use of force. And I'm not going to use specific real life examples because I'm not trying to give any attorneys out there coming after me any ideas, but I'm just going to give you the framework for what one of my reports might look like when I write them and some of the stuff that I generally include. And I think that will give you some idea, at least of the thought process and the things that you might want to bring up next time you write one of these reports, right? It's not a complete list. I'm just giving you a starting point. We've already talked about a lot of ideas here. If you're still with us, then here we are. Obviously, documentation is a big deal, and I do think that we should give a lot of time and attention to documentation. It is important. But one thing I want you to consider is that like documentation doesn't save you from creative writing in particular, does not save you from making bad decisions. It's 2024, everything's on camera, and like I said earlier, I'm glad it actually made my reports shorter because I roll the tape. Like I don't have to give you a play-by-play because it's all right there. I'm going to tell you what I was thinking and where my attention and my focus was, because the camera doesn't capture what my brain and my eyes are doing, but you get to also watch for yourself. And so it helped me, right? So those things should complement each other. But as it comes to documentation, one of the things that a myth that I've heard is people will say something like, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. I don't like that expression. Right. When I worked on an ambulance back in the day, we had these patient care reports and they were very small little, we hand wrote stuff back then, kids. And it was a small little like section, a paragraph that you can write. And I had an instructor one time and they were talking about documentation and he goes, hey, did you write down in your report that you cared for your patient in a respectful and compassionate manner? And I'm like, no, why would I write that? Like, well, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen, right? No, of course I treated them respectfully and compassionately, like I always do, right? So remember that your reports are there to help your recollection. They're there to help you recall these things if and when they go to court and you have to testify or defend yourself, right? But that always stuck with me. That being said, the things that you write are there to help you, and it should save you some trouble. So write accordingly. Be detailed and thorough as much as you can. It doesn't have to account for every little thing, and it is forgivable if you forget or misspeak in a report. You can just explain like, oh yeah, you know what? Watching the tape, you're right. That's not how it went down. That's my bad. It's okay. You're human. Humans are fallible, right? But what you do want is to save yourself some trouble by giving the reader as clear a picture of the event as you can. So when I write my report, I think about it like telling a story. I'm trying to make a movie in the person's mind that's reading this thing, right? I want the reader to feel like they're sitting in the car next to me on a ride along. And the way I start that is giving a sense of where I was and what I was doing and everything that I learned about the event. Remember those questions I talked about in that critical decision-making model? It's stuff like that, right? So at this time on this day, I was responding to this event. I was wearing this uniform. I was driving or riding in this kind of car. The lighting was whatever. The weather conditions were whatever. And that stuff matters, right? It affects your decision making. Lighting, weather, time of day, what are the things that can help with? What I'm wearing and what my car looks like. If the lighting is good, then the person should see obviously that I was the police, right? If the lighting is bad, it's really hard for me to see what they're doing with their hands. Those things matter. If it's really, really hot outside, that might affect how long we can stay out here and play this dance in this game if this person runs and gets away, right? Things like traffic conditions, right? Midday, a lot of people out. Remember the priorities of life, innocent third parties, bystanders. People are out and about, different challenges, heavy traffic versus it's middle of the night, no one's around. Those both affect my options and my choices, right? So I start with that, right? This is where I was working, I was wearing this uniform, I was in this kind of car, I was responding to the situation. Generally speaking, the lighting, the weather was like this, right? Stuff like that. Then I'm going to get into the background info about the call I was going to or the thing I was responding to, right? And I want to give a sense of, is this a call that's happening like right now in your face? This is happening fast, moving quickly. It's an emergency versus like, was I able to slow this down, collect more information? Do I have enough information? Can I get more? Can I wait for more? Or is this time sensitive and I have to go with what I got? I want to make sure that I give a very clear image in the person's mind that like, hey, I didn't have time to think about X, Y, and Z and go through all these alternatives versus I actually did have time. And this is essentially the checklist that I ran in my mind, right? Illustrate all that. And by the way, if you're wearing a body worn camera and you're going to something like this, don't be afraid to like narrate your thoughts out loud to the thing that's recording on your chest. Food for thought. So it's okay if I'm in a situation that's time sensitive, right? 911 calls happen in a hurry. I have to work with limited information. It's okay that I didn't have the answer to every question, but I should be able to explain that and to give the sense of that in the report, right? As I write this. So that might sound something like, I responded to a 911 call for a burglary in progress. The caller reported X, Y, and Z. Police communication broadcast this. The first officers on scene told me this or that. The neighbors said this. The prior calls suggested that, right? I might go through that list of all that information that I might have. Or I might say, I responded to this scene to assist officers with the suspect who fled from the scene of a domestic disturbance. He ran away on foot. Officers in the area established a perimeter in the neighborhood using red and blue lights. There was a police helicopter circling overhead with a searchlight, right? I'm setting the stage. I'm setting the scene, giving all that info, right? Or it might say something like, I went to a briefing for a SWAT surveillance support operation in an effort to apprehend so-and-so. They were wanted for these crimes with these circumstances. I was assigned to this position. Surveillance was doing this, that, the other thing. This is the information that I was learning as things went on. These were some of the factors in the intelligence provided along the way during the briefing, whatever, right? I'm going to give all that kind of background info that leads up. I'm trying to build up my story in the movie, right? Think about like how the movie would play. And someone would be like, oh, there's a climax coming, right? Like think about it like that. Then when I've set that stage and I've given that backstory, I'm going to probably start to cut to the chase, right? Okay, so I arrived on scene. I deployed my police service dog on a area search. I had these people with me as cover officers. Our search led us to the yard of X. Or I might say the surveillance units reported that the suspect was walking out of his hotel room and the SWAT team leader, Sergeant so-and-so, directed us to move in to contact him, right? Now it's getting exciting, right? I'm telling my story. So if there's any more details that go to the buildup, include it. But essentially, I'm just going to say what happened. I'm going to go right into, this is what I saw. This is what I did, right? I shined my spotlight at the person. I turned on my red and blue lights. As I stepped out of the car, I identified myself as a police and I ordered the person to stop or I'd send the dog. They ran away. I sent Chase to apprehend him. My dog's name is Chase. So all of those things are going to give context to some of that stuff we talked about earlier, right? I'm trying to paint a picture where I make clear the ability, opportunity, jeopardy, and preclusion I go into the lawful purpose, what I was doing there, what my objective was, whether anyone was in danger, what risks I was facing, right? Some of the other questions that you might want or need to answer in some of the buildup or background information is the age or size of the person, especially compared to the officers, particularly young, particularly old, military fighting age male, like those sorts of things, right? So age, size of the person, any indicators of mental health or substance use or disabilities. Jim talked about, we talked about that earlier, right? Like pretty prevalent, obviously, but specific indicators could tell you that, hey, this guy's perception of pain might be diminished. Their ability to follow instructions might be diminished. All of those things could be assigned to slow things down, but they could also give your audience a sense of your ability to communicate with that person. Speaking of language barriers, if you knew whether or not the person spoke English when you gave whatever commands or instructions, that would be helpful. Things like clothing and access to weapons, their ability to conceal weapons. If they're stripping off their clothes, that's a good warning sign of probably a big fight that's going to come, right? The in custody death, excited delirium type stuff, those things come up. You'll see people stripping off their clothes. They become hyperthermic and stuff. But also, you might get a good sense of whether or not they're armed. That could be helpful. Remember that the ability to conceal a weapon is not the same as they're presumed to be based on the circumstances. So just because they theoretically could have a gun on their person doesn't mean you can make use of force decisions thinking, well, yeah, he could have a gun in his waistband. Anyone could have a gun in their waistband. But did they commit a crime involving a gun? Was one used or known to be used or presumed to be used? That can be a factor. Same thing, like if they're hiding somewhere, I go out and look for people with the dog a lot of times. And if I know they're in a house, like I want to know, are there guns unsecured laying around in there? Does he have access to guns in a safe or anything like that? If they're in a shed or a garage, or they're like yard tools and samurai swords, I don't know what you do in your garage in your spare time, but like all those things could be things that I'd want to know if I have the opportunity. If things like crossfire or backdrop or other environmental or traffic hazards are a factor, I want to make sure that I describe those in my report. The type of less lethal force that I can use might be affected by whether or not I have a good backdrop for lethal force, right? Or some adjustment that I have to make because of one or the other. So any kind of like crossfire, backdrop issues, those things all can be factored in. One of the things that I think about in terms of canine stuff is if I'm going to drop the leash on someone running, one thing is I mentioned that like, hey, just me chasing somebody on foot is inherently dangerous, right? I'm wearing heavy equipment. It's dark. The terrain is uneven. Like blowing out a knee or an ankle could be potentially career ending. And I don't necessarily have to take additional risks for that, right? Not to mention that it gives the offender a tactical advantage. They have initiative as they turn around a corner or something like that. But also, if I let someone run away and I'm going to send the dog, where are they going to run? Is it going to be into traffic, into a populated like apartment complex, a park where a bunch of kids are playing? Those are all things that I need to factor into it as well. So just some ideas, things that you could throw into your build-up and kind of give context. Once I've essentially told the story, I said what happened, I'm going to get into like the after-action follow-up stuff. They got medical attention, what their injuries looked like, what... if there's any like required notifications, like a reporting that I have to do, that stuff's going to be in there. Anything, I'm going to take pictures of anything relevant to the story. If I can kind of give a good visual sense of like, this was my backdrop, or this was where the person was hiding, or this is where we confronted them. A lot of times the body camera is going to be real shaky, especially at night. So like if I can go back and take a picture just to kind of give context to it, or just be able to kind of diagram out what happened, those are follow-up actions that I'm probably going to document in my report. Probably the most important part of this entire thing is at the end of it, I'm going to go into like a justification. And this is where I talk about not only... it's all the stuff that I've already talked about, but there's a big difference between facts and conclusions. One thing you should never do when you're writing a report is like, I contacted this guy and he was showing, like, we have a term in our policy. It's called passive resistance. He was demonstrating passive resistance. That's a conclusion. That's something that is captured by our policy. I would rather describe factually what the person was doing that leads the reader to that conclusion, right? And so I might help them out here and say he was demonstrating, I might use those terms, those conclusions. But when I'm giving the buildup and the information, I want to actually list out the facts. What were they doing? What could I see was happening? And it should paint the picture for them. And in this paragraph, I'm going to kind of summarize it. At the very end of a big use of force report, I'm going to probably include all of that with it. So I'm going to give a recap, just big picture of lawful purpose, the background information, just again, bullet point, generalized terms, anything that I need to summarize as far as the elements of force, the ability, opportunity, and jeopardy. And then I'm going to probably go pretty in depth on the preclusion piece, the other options that I had piece, right? What other or lesser means or options were tried or available, and if not, then why? Or if they were tried, were they effective or ineffective? Would they not been practical? Like all that's I'm going to include. So that paragraph might sound something like this. I used force against so-and-so to effect his arrest, overcome resistance, and prevent his escape. He was wanted for violent felony offense against another person involving a firearm or whatever the crimes were, right? And listed out. He was a driver of a stolen car, driving like an idiot, whatever. He was fleeing on foot into a neighborhood with access to innocent people. When I confronted him, I identified myself as the police. I ordered him to stop, or I would send a police dog. There was a police helicopter overhead. There was a heavy police presence in the area. So-and-so's actions demonstrated a level of desperation despite overwhelming odds against his escape. Like, again, I'm telling the story of like, dude, where did this guy think he was going to go, right? I want to make it very clear to the reader that this guy had no other options, and he made these choices, right? He backed us into this corner, right? And he continued to flee despite my warning. Chasing a violent offender on foot in the dark over uneven terrain wearing cumbersome police equipment presents significant risk of injury to officers and provides the suspect with the opportunity to force the police to be reactive or slow to respond to his actions. He was outside of my reach to employ empty hand techniques or a baton. He was beyond the effective range of OC spray or a taser. Impact less lethal tools were not immediately available, or if they were, say why, or if they were used, they were not effective, say that. And even if they were available, I might say something to the effect of they are difficult to employ on moving targets at distance and less likely to be effective or guarantee his capture, right? I might list all those things out like, hey, like, yeah, I could shoot this guy with a pepper ball or a 40 or a beanbag. Doesn't mean I'm going to hit him, and it doesn't mean he's going to stop when he gets hit, right? Whereas a police dog can actually grab and hold on to the guy. So because of all that, the police dog was the safest and most effective way to take the guy into custody. Like, paraphrasing all of that, I'm just kind of sprinkling a little bit of everything into examples, but I will typically include some sort of justification that kind of gives my frame of reference for like, these are all the reasons that I think this is justified, right? Like, and hopefully the reader is going to take some of that away. It doesn't mean that you have to include every little detail there, right? Those should be in your report and on your camera, but it should summarize pretty well the elements of force, your lawful purpose, your preclusion piece, all of that.
I think Mike did a great job there explaining how he writes. And we've talked about this on several episodes about writing matters. In a use of force case, you're writing, among other things, to keep your job, to satisfy prosecutors. There's a lot riding on your ability to communicate why you did what you did. And I would remind all of our listeners, there's a way people write when they're trying to downplay culpability in their involvement. They tend to write very stilted, very robotic, and very passive voice. And then the suspect was shot by me. Or they use weird robotic jargon, like the vehicle was red in color.
Not read the shape.
He got out of the car with a gun in his hand and he started raising it at me, so I shot him. And then I rendered aid. The active voice is much, much more compelling to any normal reader. So I urge you, use active voice. If you can end the sentence by zombies, he was shot by me by zombies, like that doesn't work, right?
So I know this is a lot. This has been kind of a huge episode. It is a bit of a monster topic. It's not something like even in a couple hours is easy, especially to be as comprehensive. Maybe we were ambitious in some of that, but what I want you to know at the end of the day is like policy, court cases, your reports, all the academia in the world, like none of that really matters if you can't apply it in your day-to-day stuff, right? Like training and good debriefs and being like accepting feedback and getting out of your comfort zone and all the critical thinking, like whiteboards and discussions and what ifs, and like you really have to, this has to be an active and ongoing thing that you learn over the course of your career, and you think about all of it, right? Like, yes, the policy matters. Yes, what perf says matters, right? Like that stuff doesn't come up in a vacuum. And I realize that like not every agency has the time or the resources, but if there's one area that we're going to find ourselves in trouble, it's as it relates to use of force stuff. So you want to make sure that you are comprehensive in that. Like your officers should have parts of Graham versus Garner memorized, like actually memorized. And if not, pop quiz them and get them to memorize it. Like their reports should reflect the 3 prongs of Graham versus Garner. They should be able to, that decision-making model shouldn't be something that's buried in a policy somewhere. It should be something that's on the briefing board that you guys talk about when you go through an incident. Like, hey, where do we mess up here? What are we missing? And a whole bunch of other things can happen when you go through videos and you start looking at reports and comparing the two and say, hey, what other things could we have written down that might have been helpful? What things were going, what's going through your mind right now? Do the play-by-play. Pause it. Go, hey, what are you thinking about right now? Oh, I'm wondering if that house back there is occupied that he's running in front of. Or I'm wondering if, there's anyone on the other side of that corner or whatever, right? Like, talk about it. This has to be something that we get right. It's just, we've had too many bad examples and they're not going to stop, right? Like, it's part of the job. We are imperfect and the courts allow for that, but it doesn't mean that we should live, accepting that. So get better.
Yeah, this is a big topic, and there's a reason this is a big episode. And I know we're in the too long didn't read generation, and we want it faster, funnier. But if you don't know the rules, you don't know what you can do. And you need to know what your window is, what your reasonable window of options are when you're in a fight. From my point of view, use of force starts with the idea that, generally speaking, people should be safe from violence, even and especially from their own government. Let me say that again. They have a right to be safe from you, the police. Even if they're assholes. We put a whole lot of trust into you, Mr. Police Officer, Madam Police Officer, and we do it very grudgingly. Right? We're a free country. We're founded on the American Revolution and stuff like that. But we give you authority. We give you the tools and the legal authority to apply force. That authority is limited on purpose. You have to lead someone who doesn't want to be led, and you need to lead them to a safe outcome. And that requires some judgment and common sense and charisma and decision-making on your part. The better you are at fighting, the more control you're going to have and the more options you're going to have, and the harder it's going to be to overwhelm you to the point where you feel compelled to use excessive force. So getting good at fighting is going to make you better at managing your force continuum. Reasonable force doesn't mean tit for tat or matching his force or matching his energy. You have no obligation to match the bad guy. Okay? It means you are working within some boundaries and you're doing the forcing while you yourself are under control. When you do use force, you need to be ready to explain why you use force, and don't act squirrely about it, right? Use plain language and paint a picture so that if my mom reads about it in the LA Times, she's going to nod and be like, yeah, okay, I get it. That's what we're going for, because she's going to be in your jury.
Speak
right?
clearly.
Yeah. So that's that. I want you to win. I want you to win the fight. I want you to win the court case. And I want you to achieve your goal. And and make for a safe, loving, caring, compassionate society. That's what we're going for, right?
America.
All right, be safe out there. Be smart out there.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. This episode is also brought to you by 09 Holsters. We talk a lot about people, ideas, and hardware on this show, so when we invest in equipment, we always think in terms of experience first. 09 is helping you figure out how to carry the gear you need to be effective. They are built by cops, for cops, with a minimalist design and bomb-proof durability. Radio cases, flashlights, body cameras, even canine remotes, you name it, 09 has been filling a void in tactical duty holsters for more than a decade. Go see what they offer at 09 Holsters, that's ZERO, the number 9, holsters.com. 09, built to win the fight. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.